"You won't want me," she cried, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks as she backed against the weathered barn door. Jake Morrison's calloused hands froze halfway to her face, his steel-gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The setting sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold, but all he could see was the broken woman before him, the same woman who'd arrived at his ranch 3 months ago with nothing but a threadbare dress and secrets darker than a moonless night. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough as desert wind, "you don't know what you're saying." But she did know. God help her, she knew exactly what she was saying. The truth had been eating at her like acid, burning through her chest every time he looked at her with those eyes that held such tenderness, such hope. Every stolen glance across the dinner table, every accidental brush of fingers when he handed her the morning coffee, every moment when she caught him watching her tend his neglected garden with something that looked dangerously like affection. It all felt like lies now. "I know exactly what I'm saying, Jake Morrison." Her voice cracked on his name. "When you learn the truth about what I've done, about who I really am." She pressed her palms flat against the rough wood behind her, as if she could disappear into it. "You'll wish you'd never laid eyes on Catherine Mills." The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, sensing the electric tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its lonely cry echoing across the Montana plains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage scent of him, close enough to see the small scar above his left eyebrow that she'd wondered about for weeks. "Try me." But before she could answer, before she could confess the terrible truth that would surely drive him away forever, the thunder of approaching horses shattered the moment like glass. 3 months earlier, Catherine had thought she'd reached the end of everything worth living for. The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the dusty road, sending Catherine Mills sprawling against the hard wooden seat. Her carpetbag, containing everything she owned in this world, tumbled to the floor, spilling its meager contents across the coach's grimy boards. A faded daguerreotype of her parents, a worn Bible, and exactly $17.32 scattered like fallen leaves. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his voice muffled by the bandana he wore against the dust. "Willow Creek." Catherine gathered her belongings with hands that trembled only slightly. She'd trained herself not to shake, not to show weakness. 3 months of running had taught her that much. Through the coach's small window, she could see a collection of weathered buildings that barely deserved the name town. A saloon with bat-wing doors, a general store, a sheriff's office, and not much else. The mountains rose like sleeping giants beyond, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late spring warmth. The mail-order bride advertisement she'd answered lay folded in her reticule, its edges soft from handling. Respectable rancher seeks wife for companionship and practical partnership. Must be of good moral character. No drunkards or Jezebels need apply. She'd laughed bitterly when she'd first read it, knowing she failed the moral character requirement spectacularly. But desperation made liars of even the most honest women. She stepped down from the coach on unsteady legs, her blue traveling dress, her only good dress, wrinkled and dusty from the 3-day journey from Denver. The driver tossed her carpetbag down without ceremony and climbed back onto his perch, clearly eager to be gone. "Wait," Catherine called, sudden panic seizing her throat. "How do I find the Morrison Ranch?" The driver pointed toward a dirt road that led away from town. "Follow that track about 5 miles out. Can't miss it." He cracked his whip, and the coach lurched forward, leaving Catherine alone in a cloud of dust and her own rapidly mounting terror. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she picked up her bag and started walking. Her Boston-made boots, designed for sidewalks and drawing rooms, pinched with each step on the rocky ground. By the time she'd walked 2 miles, blisters were forming, and her carefully arranged hair had begun escaping its pins. That's when she saw him. He sat astride a bay gelding like he'd been born there, his silhouette dark against the blazing sky. Even from a distance, she could see the breadth of his shoulders beneath a worn leather vest, the easy way he controlled his restive horse. As she drew closer, she made out dark hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat and eyes the color of storm clouds. Jake Morrison. It had to be. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her wilted appearance, her impractical dress, the carpetbag that marked her as someone who didn't belong in this harsh country. When he finally spoke, his voice held no warmth. "You'd be Miss Catherine Mills, I expect." "I am." She lifted her chin with what dignity she could muster. "And you're Mr. Morrison." He dismounted in one fluid motion, moving with the unconscious grace of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind, the way his jaw was set like granite. This was not a man who smiled easily. "You're not what I expected," he said bluntly. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I apologize if I'm not to your liking, Mr. Morrison. But the stagecoach journey was—" "You're too fine," he interrupted. "Too soft. This country breaks soft things, Miss Mills. I should have been clearer in my advertisement." The words hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to stand straighter. She'd survived worse than a few harsh words from a cowboy who thought he knew her. "Perhaps you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, Mr. Morrison. I assure you I'm stronger than I appear." Something flickered in those gray eyes. Surprise, maybe, or grudging respect. He was quiet for so long she wondered if he meant to send her back to town. Finally, he reached for the reins of his horse. "We'll see about that, I suppose. Climb up." "I beg your pardon?" "The horse, Miss Mills, unless you plan to walk the rest of the way." She stared at the bay gelding, whose back seemed impossibly high from where she stood. "I've never... that is, ladies in Boston don't typically..." "This isn't Boston." He moved behind her, and before she could protest, his hands spanned her waist, lifting her up to sit side saddle behind the saddle horn. The contact lasted only seconds, but she felt the strength in those hands, the carefully controlled power. He swung up behind her, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. Catherine tried to hold herself stiff, away from him, but the horse's movement made that impossible. Within minutes, she was acutely aware of the solid warmth at her back, the way his arms bracketed her as he held the reins. "Hold on," he said quietly. But Catherine was beginning to understand that holding on might not be enough to survive what lay ahead. The Morrison Ranch materialized from the endless prairie like something born from the earth itself. Catherine's first glimpse of her new home came as they crested a low hill, the setting sun painting everything in shades of copper and gold. The house was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories of sturdy log construction with a wide front porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and yellow light glowed warmly in the windows. A barn and several outbuildings dotted the landscape, and she could see cattle moving like dark shadows across the distant pasture. "It's beautiful," she breathed, and meant it. Jake's only response was a grunt that might have been agreement. He guided the horse toward the barn, where he dismounted and helped her down with the same impersonal efficiency he'd shown before. His hands lingered at her waist for just a moment, and she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "This way," he said, shouldering her carpet bag. The house smelled of coffee and leather and something else, loneliness perhaps, or simply the absence of a woman's touch. The main room was spartanly furnished but clean, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a heavy oak table that looked like it could seat 8 people. Everything was built to last, built by a man who planned to stay. "Kitchen's through there," Jake said, pointing to a doorway. "Your room's upstairs, second door on the right. There's a washstand and basin, and I laid out some linens this morning." Catherine set down her reticule and looked around, trying to imagine herself living in this place, cooking at that massive stove, sitting across from this stern stranger at breakfast. "It's very nice, Mr. Morrison. You have a lovely home." He was standing by the window now, staring out at the darkening landscape. "We should discuss terms." The businesslike tone made her stomach clench. "Terms?" "This arrangement. What I expect. What you can expect in return." He turned to face her, and in the lamplight, his features looked carved from stone. "I'll provide food, shelter, protection. In return, you'll keep house, cook, tend the garden. There's a chicken coop out back that needs attention, and I expect you know something about preserving food for winter." Catherine nodded, though her knowledge of such things was largely theoretical, gleaned from books rather than experience. "Of course. There'll be no intimacy," he continued, and she felt her cheeks flame. "Not until we know if this arrangement will work. We're strangers, Miss Mills, and I won't have a woman in my bed who's only there out of obligation or desperation." The bluntness of his words took her breath away. "I understand. Do you?" He stepped closer, and she caught that scent again, leather and sage and something indefinably masculine. "Because you look like a woman who's been running from something, and I need to know that whatever it is won't follow you here. I've worked too hard building this place to have it destroyed by someone else's troubles." Catherine's mouth went dry. Could he see it so clearly? The guilt that ate at her, the fear that followed her like a shadow. "I assure you, Mr. Morrison, I have no intention of bringing any complications to your door." "See that you don't." He moved toward the stairs, then paused with his hand on the banister. "Breakfast is at sunrise. I'll expect you in the kitchen by 5:30. "Of course." She watched him climb the stairs, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. When she heard his door close, she finally allowed herself to breathe. Alone in the unfamiliar room, Catherine sank into one of the chairs by the table and buried her face in her hands. What had she done? She was 1,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, in the house of a man who clearly wished he'd never answered her letter. And the secret she carried, the terrible thing that had driven her to this desperate measure, felt like a stone in her chest. Outside, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and wild. Catherine rose and moved to the window, looking out at the vast darkness that stretched beyond the circle of lamplight. Somewhere out there, past the mountains and plains, was the life she'd left behind. The scandal that had destroyed her reputation, the accusations that had driven her from Boston in the dead of night. The worst part was that they weren't entirely wrong about her. She'd been engaged to Charles Whitmore, the son of Boston's most prominent banking family. Handsome, charming Charles, who'd swept her off her feet with his pretty words and expensive gifts. She'd thought herself the luckiest woman in Massachusetts, right up until the night she'd discovered him in a compromising position with her own cousin Margaret in the Whitmore family carriage. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was what happened after. Catherine pressed her forehead against the cool glass and tried not to remember the sound of Charles's voice when she'd confronted him, the ugly words he'd used to describe what he thought of her intelligence, her worth, her future. How he'd laughed when she'd threatened to tell his parents, because who would believe her word against his? He hadn't been laughing 3 days later when she'd walked into his father's bank with a ledger she'd stolen from Charles's private desk. A ledger that detailed every illegal transaction, every bribe, every stolen dollar that had made the Whitmore fortune possible. She'd meant to expose him, to see justice done. Instead, she'd started a chain of events that had destroyed not just Charles, but his innocent younger sister, his aging parents, dozens of bank employees who'd lost their positions when the scandal broke. The newspapers had called her a scorned woman seeking revenge. Society had branded her a thief and a liar. But the worst condemnation had come from her own conscience, because she knew the truth. She'd acted not from a desire for justice, but from pure, selfish rage. A sound from upstairs made her look up. Jake moving around in his room, probably preparing for bed. She wondered what dreams haunted a man like him, what ghosts followed him into sleep. Tomorrow, she would begin trying to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. She would learn to cook and clean and tend chickens, to be the kind of woman who belonged in this harsh, beautiful country. She would prove to Jake Morrison that she was more than a soft, useless city girl. But tonight, alone in the darkness with only the howling wind for company, Catherine faced the truth that had driven her halfway across the continent. Some sins followed you no matter how far you ran. Dawn in Montana came like a slap across the face, sudden, harsh, and impossible to ignore. Catherine jolted awake to the sound of someone moving around downstairs, boots heavy on the wooden floors. Sunlight was already streaming through her bedroom window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. She fumbled for the small clock on her nightstand and felt her heart sink. 6:15. She was supposed to have been in the kitchen 45 minutes ago. She threw on her wrapper and hurried downstairs, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. The kitchen was empty, but she could smell coffee and see evidence that Jake had already eaten. A plate and cup sitting by the wash basin, crumbs on the cutting board where he'd sliced bread. A piece of paper on the table caught her eye, covered in Jake's angular handwriting. Gone to check the north pasture. Back by noon. There's eggs in the henhouse and bacon in the pantry. The stove can be temperamental. Catherine stared at the note, shame burning in her chest. Her first day, and she'd already failed at the most basic requirement. She folded the paper carefully and set it aside, then looked around the kitchen with new eyes. It was a large room, clearly designed by a man who understood the practical needs of ranch life. A massive black stove dominated one wall, its surface already warm to the touch. Open shelves held dishes and cooking implements, and a window above the sink looked out over the kitchen garden, or what had once been a garden. Now it was mostly weeds and overgrown herbs, testament to a house without a woman's care. The pantry revealed Jake's bachelor existence in stark detail. Sides of bacon and salt pork, bags of flour and cornmeal, canned goods, and little else. No preserves, no pickles, none of the dozens of small luxuries that made a house a home. Catherine found herself wondering about the woman who'd lived here before. Jake wore a wedding ring on a chain around his neck, she'd noticed, tucked beneath his shirt. What had happened to her? And why did the house feel so deliberately empty of feminine touches? The henhouse proved to be her first real challenge. The chickens regarded her with the sort of disdain usually reserved for tax collectors and traveling salesmen. When she reached tentatively for an egg, the nearest hen let out a shriek that made her jump backward, stumbling over her own feet and landing hard in the dirt. "Well, that's a fine start," she muttered, brushing dust from her wrapper. It took her 20 minutes and considerable negotiation to collect half a dozen eggs, by which time she was covered in dirt and feathers, and the chickens had made their opinion of her perfectly clear. She trudged back to the house feeling like she'd already failed at the most basic frontier skill. The bacon proved no easier. The stove, as Jake had warned, was temperamental, and she couldn't seem to find the right heat. The first batch burned black while she was trying to figure out how to work the oven. The second batch she took off too early, leaving it pale and greasy. By the time she heard Jake's horse approaching, she had managed to produce something that was at least edible, though it bore little resemblance to the perfect breakfasts she remembered from her childhood home in Boston. She was standing at the stove, hair escaping from a hastily arranged bun, her second-best dress spotted with grease, when he walked through the door. He took in the scene with those storm-gray eyes, the charred pan soaking in the sink, the flour scattered across the counter, her general appearance of defeat. And his jaw tightened. "I overslept," she said quickly. "I'm sorry. Tomorrow I'll—" "How long since you've cooked a meal, Miss Mills?" The question was quiet, but she heard the edge in it. That is—" She twisted her hands in her apron. "My family had servants, but I watched our cook many times, and I read several books on domestic management before I left Boston." Books. He said it like it was a foreign word. "I know how it must seem, but I'm a quick learner, Mr. Morrison. Give me a chance, and I promise I'll—" "Can you milk a cow?" So, churn butter?" "No, but—" "Preserve meat? Make soap? Birth a calf?" Each question was a blow, stripping away her carefully constructed confidence. "No," she whispered. Jake removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, and for a moment he looked older than his 30-odd years. "What exactly did you think you were coming here to do, Miss Mills?" The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Catherine felt something inside her, something that had been bent and broken in Boston, suddenly straighten. She'd run from one set of people who thought her worthless. She'd be damned if she'd run from another. "I thought I was coming here to learn," she said, lifting her chin, "to become the kind of woman who could be useful to a man like you. I may not know how to milk a cow yet, Mr. Morrison, but I can read and write and figure sums. I can organize and plan and work harder than you might think. And if you'll give me the chance, I can learn everything else." Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or the first stirring of respect. "This isn't Boston, Miss Mills. Out here, good intentions won't keep you alive when winter comes. You need skills, and you need them now." "Then teach me." The words escaped before she could stop them, bold and desperate and completely honest. Jake studied her face for a long moment, taking in the determination she was trying so hard to project, the fear she was trying equally hard to hide. "Eat your breakfast," he said finally. "Then we'll start with the chickens." But as he sat down at the table and began eating the imperfect meal she'd prepared, Catherine caught something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly, but not dismissal either. It was, she thought, the sound of a door opening, just a crack. 2 weeks of frontier life had transformed Catherine Mills in ways she never could have imagined. Her hands, once smooth and white as porcelain, were now calloused and stained with garden soil. Her hair, which she'd once arranged in elaborate Boston styles, was pulled back in a simple bun that could survive a day of hard work. And her dresses, well, her dresses would have scandalized the ladies of Beacon Hill, but they were practical now, shortened to keep the hems out of the mud and reinforced at the elbows, where honest work had worn them thin. She was in the kitchen garden at dawn, pulling weeds with a determination that bordered on the religious, when she heard the distinctive sound of multiple horses approaching. Catherine straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and shaded her eyes against the rising sun. 3 men rode toward the house, and something about their approach made her stomach clench with unease. They weren't sitting their horses like honest ranchers or neighbors making a social call. There was something predatory in the way they moved, something that made every instinct she'd developed in Boston, where she'd learned to recognize dangerous men by their stance alone, scream warnings. The man in the center was well-dressed, his black suit expensive even by city standards. His horse was a fine-blooded bay, and his saddle was tooled leather that probably cost more than most people made in a year. But it was his eyes that made Catherine's blood run cold, pale blue and calculating, the kind of eyes that saw people as things to be used. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching his hat in a gesture that was mockery more than courtesy. "Name's Harrison Dalton. I'm looking for Jake Morrison." Catherine had heard that name whispered in town when she'd gone for supplies the previous week. Dalton owned the largest spread in the territory, and according to the rumors, he wasn't particular about how he acquired his land. Several smaller ranchers had sold to him after mysterious accidents befell their cattle, their water sources, sometimes their homes. "Mr. Morrison is checking the cattle," she said carefully. "I could take a message." Dalton's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "And you would be?" "Catherine Mills." She didn't elaborate, didn't mention their arrangement. Something told her the less this man knew about her circumstances, the better. Ah, the mail-order bride. The way he said it made her skin crawl. How enterprising of Jake. Though I have to wonder what a lady like you is doing in a place like this. The 2 men flanking him chuckled, and Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she'd learned something in the past 2 weeks. She'd learned that respect had to be earned, and it started with respecting yourself. "I'm learning that appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Dalton," she said coolly. "Perhaps you'd care to state your business and be on your way." The amusement faded from Dalton's eyes, replaced by something harder. "My business is with Morrison. Tell him I stopped by to discuss his water situation. The drought's been hard on everyone, and I'd hate to see a neighbor suffer unnecessarily." The threat was barely veiled, and Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "I'll give him your message." "See that you do." Dalton gathered his reins, then paused. "You know, Miss Mills, a woman like you might find life easier at a more established ranch. A place where she wouldn't have to worry about the uncertainties of frontier life. If you ever tire of playing house with Morrison, you know where to find me." The insult hit her like a physical blow, but Catherine kept her expression steady. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Dalton, but I'm quite content where I am." "Are you?" His gaze moved over the modest ranch, the small house, the evidence of hard work and harder living. "We'll see how content you are when winter comes." They rode away at a leisurely pace, making it clear they felt no urgency to leave Morrison land. Catherine watched them go, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She'd encountered men like Dalton in Boston, wealthy, powerful, convinced that everything and everyone was for sale at the right price. But out here, with no law closer than the county seat 50 miles away, such men were infinitely more dangerous. She was still standing in the garden when Jake returned an hour later. He took one look at her face and dismounted quickly, moving toward her with that easy stride that covered ground faster than it appeared. "What happened?" "Harrison Dalton was here." She watched Jake's expression harden. "He said to tell you he wanted to discuss your water situation. And he..." She hesitated, then forged ahead. "He made it clear he thinks I'd be better off somewhere else." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "What exactly did he say?" Catherine repeated the conversation as accurately as she could, watching Jake's jaw grow tighter with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the direction Dalton had gone. "He's been pressuring the smaller ranchers," Jake said finally, "buying them out or forcing them to sell. The Hendersons sold last month after their well mysteriously dried up. The McLeods lost half their herd to poisoned water holes. And now he's coming for you. Looks that way." Jake turned to study her face. "Catherine, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Are you having second thoughts about this arrangement? Because if Dalton's right, if you'd be better off somewhere else." The question hit her harder than she'd expected. In the past 2 weeks, she'd learned to milk cows and churn butter, to preserve meat and make soap from ashes and fat. She'd burned her hands on the temperamental stove and her back on the endless laundry, had fought with chickens and lost to a particularly stubborn sow. But she'd also watched sunrises that painted the sky in colors she'd never dreamed possible, had felt the satisfaction of eating food she'd grown with her own hands, had begun to understand why a man would fight to protect this harsh, beautiful land. And she'd begun to understand Jake Morrison himself, the way he gentled his voice when he was teaching her something new, the careful distance he maintained even as his eyes softened when he looked at her, the quiet strength that made her feel safer than she had in months. "No," she said firmly, "I'm not having second thoughts." Something flickered in his storm-gray eyes. Relief, maybe, or something deeper. "Good, because I think we're going to need each other before this is over." But as they walked toward the house together, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that Harrison Dalton's visit was just the beginning. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Jake found 2 of his best breeding cows dead by the creek. Catherine heard him cursing from the kitchen, a string of words that would have made her Boston finishing school teachers faint dead away. She set down the bread dough she'd been kneading and hurried outside, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. Jake was standing knee-deep in the creek, examining something in the water. His face was thunderous, and even from a distance she could see the tension in his shoulders. "What is it?" she called. "Poison." The word carried clearly across the morning air. Someone dumped something upstream. These cows were likely drinking here at dawn. Catherine felt her stomach drop. "Dalton? Who else?" Jake waded back to shore, his boots squelching in the mud. "He's escalating. This isn't just pressure anymore, this is war." She followed him as he strode toward the barn, his movements sharp with controlled anger. "What do we do?" "We?" He stopped so abruptly she almost collided with him. When he turned, his gray eyes were hard as flint. "There is no we in this, Catherine. This is my fight, my problem to solve. I won't have you caught in the middle of it." The dismissal stung worse than she'd expected. "This is my home too now." "Is it?" The question came out harsher than he'd probably intended. Because when things get dangerous, and they will get dangerous, you have somewhere else to go. You can pack up that carpet bag and take the next stagecoach back to Boston. I'm stuck here." Catherine stared at him, seeing past the anger to the fear beneath. This ranch wasn't just Jake's livelihood. It was everything he was, everything he'd built after losing whatever had put those shadows in his eyes. The thought of losing it was eating him alive. "You're right," she said quietly. "I could leave, but I won't." "Catherine, do you know what I was in Boston, Jake?" The words spilled out before she could stop them. "I was a decoration, a pretty thing kept in a parlor to be admired and eventually married off to the highest bidder. I never did anything that mattered, never made a decision that affected anyone but myself. And when I finally did try to do something important," she swallowed hard, "I destroyed everything I touched." Jake was watching her intently now, the anger replaced by something that might have been understanding. "But here," she continued, "I matter. The chickens need me to collect their eggs. The garden needs me to tend it. You need me too." She faltered, realizing she'd revealed more than she'd intended. "To what?" His voice was gentler now. "To stand with you," she whispered. "To be someone you can count on when everything falls apart. Don't take that away from me, Jake. Don't send me back to being useless." For a long moment, they stood there in the morning sunlight, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. Then Jake reached out and touched her face, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You're not useless," he said roughly, "and you haven't destroyed everything you've touched. You've made this place." He gestured toward the house, the garden, the signs of care that had appeared over the past weeks. "You've made it feel like a home again." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, something that had been frozen since Boston beginning to thaw. "Then let me help you protect it." Jake studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her determination against his protective instincts. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments, no heroics. Agreed?" "Agreed." "Good." He turned back toward the barn. "Then help me bury these cows before they draw scavengers. And tonight, we're going to town." "Town?" "To see the sheriff. If Dalton thinks he can escalate this without consequences, he's about to learn otherwise." But even as they worked together in grim silence, dragging the dead cattle away from the water source, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that going to the authorities might be exactly what Dalton was hoping they'd do. That evening, as they rode toward Willow Creek in Jake's buckboard, she found herself studying his profile in the fading light. The strong jaw, the weather-beaten features, the way he held himself with unconscious confidence even in the face of mounting trouble. When had she stopped seeing him as a stranger and started seeing him as... what? A partner? A protector? Something more? The thought should have terrified her. After Charles, after the disaster in Boston, she'd promised herself she'd never trust her heart to a man again. But Jake Morrison was nothing like the polished, civilized men she'd known in the city. There was something fundamentally honest about him, something solid and dependable that called to parts of her she'd forgotten existed. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, glancing over at her. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was just thinking about what we'll tell Sheriff Mason." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and from the way Jake's eyes lingered on her face, she suspected he knew it. "We'll tell him the truth," Jake said, "that Dalton's trying to force me off my land and he's willing to kill my cattle to do it." "And if the sheriff won't help?" Jake's hands tightened on the reins. "Then we'll handle it ourselves." The words sent a chill through Catherine that had nothing to do with the evening air, because she could hear in his voice that he meant every word. Sheriff Tom Mason was exactly the kind of lawman Catherine had expected to find in a frontier town. Weathered, practical, and thoroughly unimpressed by anyone's problems. He listened to Jake's account of the poisoned cattle with the expression of a man who'd heard every sob story in the territory twice over. When Jake finished, Mason leaned back in his chair and studied them both with eyes that had seen too much. "Poisoned cattle, you say?" Mason's tone was carefully neutral. "You got proof it was Dalton?" "Who else would it be, Tom?" Jake's patience was clearly wearing thin. "He was at my ranch just yesterday making threats." "Threats?" Mason picked up a pencil and made a note on a piece of paper. "What kind of threats?" Catherine watched Jake struggle to put Dalton's veiled words into concrete terms that would satisfy a lawman. The problem was, Men like Dalton were experts at making their meaning clear without saying anything that could be used against them in court. He suggested I might want to reconsider my water situation, Jake said finally. Said he'd hate to see a neighbor suffer unnecessarily. Mason set down his pencil. That's not exactly a confession to cattle poisoning, Jake. It's enough when combined with everything else that's been happening around here. Jake leaned forward in his chair. The Henderson well, the McLeod water holes, the Patterson barn fire. Now hold on. Mason raised a hand. You're talking about incidents spread out over 6 months, involving different people. Could be coincidence. Could be, Jake agreed grimly. But it's not. Catherine had been listening to this exchange with growing frustration. Based on the search results, I can see this is part of a series of Wild West romance stories with similar themes. Let me continue the story, maintaining the established style and narrative flow. She watched Mason and Jake circle each other verbally like wary dogs, and felt her Boston-bred instincts for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense finally serve a useful purpose. "Sheriff Mason," she said quietly, but with enough steel in her voice to make both men look at her. "May I ask how much property Harrison Dalton owns in this territory?" Mason's eyebrows rose. "Well, I suppose that's public record. Near about 40,000 acres last I heard." "Why?" "And how much did he own, say, 2 years ago?" The sheriff's expression grew thoughtful. "Maybe half that. He's been expanding his holdings." "Through legitimate purchases?" "Now, see here, Miss Mills. At fair market prices?" Catherine pressed. "With willing sellers who had other options?" Mason was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. "Point taken, but suspicion isn't evidence, and I can't arrest a man for being a successful businessman. Even when his success comes at the cost of his neighbors' livelihoods?" Jake's voice was tight with frustration. "Tom, you know what's happening here. Dalton wants every drop of water, every acre of grazing land between here and the mountains, and he doesn't much care how he gets it." "What I know and what I can prove in court are 2 different things," Mason replied. "Bring me something concrete, a witness, physical evidence, something that'll hold up before a judge, and I'll act on it." Jake started to respond, but Catherine placed a hand on his arm. "What about documentation, Sheriff? Surely there are records of these property transfers, surveys, water rights assessments." "Course there are, all filed proper with the territorial office." "And who handles those filings locally?" Mason's expression grew wary. "Marcus Webb. He's the territorial assessor for this district." Catherine felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. "And would Mr. Webb happen to be a business associate of Mr. Dalton's?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "I see," Catherine continued. "So the man who decides property values, water rights, and survey disputes is also the man who benefits when small ranchers are forced to sell. How convenient." Mason shifted uncomfortably. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Mills." "It's not an accusation, Sheriff. It's a question, but thank you for answering it." Jake was staring at her with something that might have been admiration. "Catherine's right. Webb's been involved in every one of these transfers. He's the one who declared the Henderson well naturally depleted. He's the one who ruled the McLeod boundary markers had been incorrectly placed. And I'm betting he's the one who'll determine that my cattle died of natural causes." "Even if that's true," Mason said slowly, "proving corruption is a sight harder than suspecting it." Catherine smiled, and there was nothing soft or city-bred about the expression. "Then perhaps it's time someone started paying attention to the details, Sheriff. A man who's been getting rich off his neighbor's misfortune might not be as careful about covering his tracks as he thinks. As they left the sheriff's office, Jake was quiet until they were well out of town. Finally, he looked over at her with something like awe. Where did that come from? Catherine smoothed her skirts, suddenly self-conscious. Boston. I may not know how to milk a cow, but I know how corrupt men operate. They're the same everywhere, arrogant, careless, and convinced they're too clever to get caught. And you think Webb is careless? I think Webb is a small-town official who suddenly has access to more money than he's ever seen in his life. Men like that make mistakes. She paused. The question is, are we prepared to find them? Jake's hands tightened on the reins. What exactly are you suggesting? Catherine looked back toward town, where lamplight was beginning to flicker in windows as evening approached. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Marcus Webb kept records that could expose the whole conspiracy, if they could get to them. I'm suggesting that sometimes the law needs a little help finding the truth. But even as she said it, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than either of them realized. The plan they hatched over coffee in Catherine's kitchen was either brilliant or completely insane. She wasn't entirely sure which. Webb keeps his official records in the territorial office, Jake said, spreading a rough map of the town on the table. But Martha Henderson mentioned he also keeps copies at his house. Something about not trusting the security of public buildings. Catherine studied the map, her finger tracing the streets of Willow Creek. His house is here, on Elm Street, 2 blocks from Main, backing up to Willow Creek itself. You've been paying attention. In Boston, I learned that knowing your neighbor's business could be a matter of survival. Catherine set down her coffee cup. Webb's wife goes to the ladies' auxiliary meetings every Thursday evening. They run L.A.T., usually until 10 o'clock. How do you know that? Catherine smiled grimly. Because Mrs. Patterson invited me to join, and I made excuses by asking detailed questions about the schedule. Knowledge is power, Jake, especially when you're planning something inadvisable. Jake leaned back in his chair, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. This is inadvisable, Catherine. If we're caught, we'll be arrested for breaking and entering. If we do nothing, you'll lose your ranch, and Dalton will own half the territory. She met his gaze steadily. I've already lost everything once, Jake. I won't stand by and watch it happen to you. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. Why are you willing to take this risk? For me, for this place? The honest answer would have been too revealing, too dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. Instead, she said, because it's the right thing to do, and because I'm tired of running from problems instead of solving them. Jake nodded slowly. All right, but we do this my way. You get me inside, then you wait with the horses. If something goes wrong, we'll handle it together. Catherine's voice brooked no argument. I'm not some fragile flower who'll faint at the first sign of trouble, Jake Morrison. I proved that much when I tracked down Charles Whitmore's embezzlement records. What? The words had slipped out before she could stop them. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized she'd revealed more about her past than she'd ever intended. Nothing, she said quickly. It doesn't matter. Like hell it doesn't. Jake leaned forward, his eyes intense. Catherine, what exactly happened in Boston? What did you do that sent you running halfway across the country? For a moment she was tempted to tell him everything, about Charles, about the stolen ledger, about the lives ruined by her quest for revenge. But the shame of it, the knowledge of how he'd look at her once he knew the truth, kept the words locked in her throat. It's not important, she repeated. What matters is Thursday night. Jake studied her face for a long moment, clearly wanting to push the issue. Finally, he nodded. Thursday night, then. But Catherine, Promise me if this goes wrong, you'll run. Don't try to be a hero." "I promise," she said, crossing her fingers beneath the table like a schoolgirl. Thursday evening arrived gray and cold, with clouds building on the horizon that promised rain before midnight. Catherine dressed carefully in her darkest dress and pinned her hair back severely, trying to look like someone who belonged in the shadows. Jake was waiting by the barn when she arrived, holding the reins of 2 saddled horses. He'd traded his usual work clothes for dark trousers and a black shirt that made him blend into the gathering dusk. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." They rode toward town in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The streets of Willow Creek were largely empty, most folks having settled in for the evening. Yellow lamplight glowed in windows, and somewhere a dog barked at their passing. Webb's house was a neat 2-story structure with a well-maintained garden and a picket fence that spoke of middle-class respectability. More importantly, it was dark except for a single light in what appeared to be an upstairs bedroom. They left the horses tied in a grove of cottonwoods by the creek, close enough to reach quickly if they needed to leave in a hurry. Jake pulled a set of lockpicks from his pocket, catching Catherine's surprised look. "Misspent youth," he said with a grim smile, "before I learned the value of honest work." The back door yielded to his ministrations in less than 2 minutes. They slipped inside, moving by the faint moonlight that filtered through the windows. The house smelled of furniture polish and the lingering aroma of pot roast. "His office is likely upstairs," Catherine whispered. "Most men like to keep their important papers away from the common areas." They found the room on the 2nd floor, a small space lined with filing cabinets and dominated by a large desk covered in papers. Jake lit a small lantern they'd brought, keeping the flame low. "What are we looking for exactly?" he asked, moving toward the nearest filing cabinet. "Correspondence, financial records, anything that shows payments from Dalton or irregular income." Catherine was already rifling through the papers on the desk. "Men like Webb keep meticulous records. It's both their strength and their weakness." It took nearly an hour, but they found what they were looking for in a locked drawer of Webb's desk. Catherine's lockpicking skills, learned during childhood games with her cousin, proved adequate to the task. "Jake," she breathed, pulling out a leather portfolio. "Look at this." The portfolio contained copies of every questionable land deal in the territory over the past 2 years, along with detailed records of payments made by Harrison Dalton to Marcus Webb. But more damning than the money trail were the letters, correspondence between Webb and Dalton discussing specific properties, specific methods for forcing sales. "This is it," Jake said, his voice tight with excitement. "This proves everything." Catherine was copying key documents when they heard it, the sound of a horse approaching at speed. She blew out the lantern, plunging them into darkness just as hoofbeats stopped in front of the house. "Webb's early," Jake whispered. "Back door now." But as they crept toward the stairs, the front door opened with a bang. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, and a voice called out, not Webb's cultured tones, but something rougher, more dangerous. "I know you're in there," the voice said, and Catherine's blood turned to ice as she recognized it. Harrison Dalton. "Come out now and maybe I won't burn the house down around you." Catherine and Jake exchanged a look in the darkness. They were trapped on the 2nd floor of a house surrounded by Dalton's men, with evidence of conspiracy clutched in Catherine's trembling hands. But as footsteps began climbing the stairs toward them, Catherine realized this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment she'd decided to stand and fight instead of run. The window was their only option, and it was a 20-foot drop to the hard-packed earth below. Jake was already working the catch, his fingers steady despite the approaching footsteps on the stairs. Catherine gathered the copied documents, stuffing them inside her bodice where they'd be safe even if everything else went wrong. "Can you make that jump?" Jake whispered. Catherine looked down at the moonlit ground and felt her stomach lurch. Do I have a choice? Not really. He eased the window open, wincing at the small creak it made. I'll go first, then catch you. Miss Mills, Dalton's voice boomed from the hallway below. I know you're up there. You and your cowboy friend. Come down now, and we'll discuss this like civilized people. Catherine almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Nothing about Harrison Dalton was civilized. Jake swung his leg over the windowsill, then paused to look back at her. Catherine, whatever happens, don't, she whispered fiercely. Don't you dare say goodbye to me, Jake Morrison. We're getting out of this. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, admiration, something that looked dangerously like love. Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness below. Catherine heard him land with a muffled thud, followed by a low curse that suggested the impact hadn't been pleasant. But a moment later, his voice drifted up. Come on. The footsteps were at the top of the stairs now, moving toward Webb's office. Catherine hiked up her skirts and climbed onto the windowsill, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ground seemed impossibly far away. Now, Catherine. She jumped. For a terrifying moment, she was falling through empty air, her skirts billowing around her like dark wings. Then Jake's arms closed around her, breaking her fall and sending them both tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs and breathless gasps. You all right? He asked, helping her to her feet. Before she could answer, light blazed from the upstairs window they'd just vacated. Dalton's silhouette appeared, and she heard his roar of fury echo across the quiet neighborhood. Find them, he shouted. They can't have gone far. Jake grabbed her hand, and they ran toward the creek where they'd left the horses. Behind them, she could hear Dalton's men spreading out, their voices carrying clearly in the night air. Too clearly. They were making no effort at stealth, which meant they weren't worried about witnesses, which meant they planned to make sure there were no witnesses to worry about. The horses were restless, sensing their urgency. Jake boosted Catherine into the saddle, then swung up onto his own mount just as the first of Dalton's men appeared through the trees. There! The shout split the night. By the creek! Gunshots erupted behind them as they spurred their horses into motion, crashing through the underbrush toward open ground. Catherine bent low over her horse's neck, feeling bullets whistle past with deadly precision. They burst from the tree line into the open prairie, their horses' hooves thundering against the earth. More shots rang out, but they were harder targets now, moving fast across broken ground in uncertain moonlight. The ranch, Jake called over the wind. We can make a stand there. But even as he said it, Catherine could see more riders converging from different directions. Dalton had planned this carefully, anticipating their escape routes. They were being herded like cattle toward a killing ground of his choosing. No, Catherine called back. The church. Pastor Williams. Jake's head snapped toward her, understanding flickering in his eyes. Pastor Williams had a reputation for protecting anyone who sought sanctuary, regardless of their troubles. More importantly, his church was sacred ground. Even Dalton would hesitate to commit murder there. They changed direction, angling toward the white steeple that rose against the star-filled sky. Their pursuers followed, but more cautiously now, realizing where they were headed. The church doors were unlocked. They always were, according to local tradition. Jake and Catherine stumbled inside, breathing hard, their clothes torn and their faces scratched from the wild ride through brush and brambles. Pastor Williams, Catherine called. Please, we need help. A door opened behind the altar, and the pastor emerged in his nightshirt, carrying a lamp. His eyes widened when he saw them, disheveled, desperate, clearly running from something. Miss Mills? Mr. Morrison? What's the meaning of this? Harrison Dalton is trying to kill us, Jake said bluntly. "We have evidence of his corruption, and he means to silence us permanently." Pastor Williams's face went pale. Outside, they could hear horses approaching, voices calling commands. "Evidence?" Catherine pulled the documents from her bodice, her hands shaking as she handed them over. "Proof that Dalton's been bribing Marcus Webb to force people off their land. Proof that he's been stealing everything that isn't nailed down and some things that are." The pastor's eyes grew wide as he scanned the papers by lamplight. Dear God, the scope of this. It's monstrous. The church doors slammed open, and Harrison Dalton strode in with 4 armed men behind him. His face was flushed with rage, and his expensive suit was disheveled from the pursuit. "Pastor," he said with false courtesy, "I apologize for disturbing your evening, but these 2 are criminals, thieves who broke into Marcus Webb's home and stole private documents." "Is that what we are?" Catherine asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Because those documents suggest you're the thief, Mr. Dalton, along with being a liar, a cheat, and a murderer of innocent cattle." Dalton's mask of civility slipped. "You little bitch. You have no idea what you're interfering with." "Language, Mr. Dalton," Pastor Williams said quietly. "This is God's house." "Then surely God wants justice done," Dalton replied smoothly. "Hand over those documents, Pastor, and I'll see these 2 get the fair trial they deserve." Catherine almost laughed. A fair trial from Dalton would last about as long as it took to find a rope and a tree. Pastor Williams looked down at the papers in his hands, then at Catherine and Jake, then at Dalton's armed men. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mr. Dalton." "Excuse me?" "These people have sought sanctuary in God's house. By law and by tradition, they're under my protection until the proper authorities can be notified." The pastor's voice grew stronger with each word. "Sheriff Mason will need to see this evidence and make his own determination about who the real criminals are." Dalton's face went purple. "You self-righteous fool. Do you have any idea who you're protecting? She's a wanted criminal from Boston, embezzlement, fraud, ruining innocent families. Ask her about Charles Whitmore and see how quick she is to claim innocence then." Catherine felt the world tilt beneath her feet. How could Dalton possibly know about Boston? About Charles? Unless... "That's right," Dalton continued, seeing her shocked expression. "You think I'd invest in property out here without investigating everyone involved? I know exactly who Catherine Mills really is, and so does everyone else who matters. A thief and a liar who destroys everything she touches." But instead of the shame and terror she'd expected to feel, Catherine found herself getting angry. Furiously, righteously angry. "You want to talk about destroying things, Mr. Dalton?" She stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "Let's talk about the Henderson family, forced off land their grandfather homesteaded. Let's talk about the McLeod children who'll go hungry this winter because you poisoned their cattle. Let's talk about Jake's breeding stock, killed because you couldn't bear the thought of anyone else prospering in your kingdom." "Catherine," Jake said quietly, but she was beyond stopping now. "Yes, I made mistakes in Boston. Yes, I hurt people I shouldn't have hurt. But I was trying to expose corruption, not create it. I was trying to see justice done, not prevent it. Can you say the same?" The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Pastor Williams stepped forward, the document still clutched in his hands. "Mr. Dalton, I think you'd better leave. Now." But Catherine could see in Dalton's eyes that he wasn't going anywhere without those papers, even if it meant spilling blood on consecrated ground. What happened next would be talked about in Willow Creek for generations to come. Pastor Williams stood in the center aisle of his church, a slight man in a nightshirt holding a lamp and a handful of papers, facing down 5 armed men who'd made fortunes through violence and intimidation. By all rights, it should have been a massacre. Instead, the church doors burst open again, and Sheriff Mason strode in with 3 deputies, their guns drawn and their faces grim. "Well, well," Mason said, taking in the scene. "Quite a gathering we have here." Dalton spun around, his face cycling through surprise, relief, and calculation. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. These criminals broke into Marcus Webb's home and—" "I know what they did, Harrison." Mason's voice was flat, professional. "Mrs. Patterson saw them running from Webb's place, saw your men chasing them with guns drawn. Figured I'd better investigate before someone got killed in my town." Catherine felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Mason was more honest than they'd given him credit for. "Then arrest them," Dalton demanded. "Breaking and entering, theft." "Oh, I intend to arrest someone tonight," Mason agreed. "The question is who?" He looked at Pastor Williams. "Pastor, I understand you have some documents there?" Williams nodded, handing over the papers with obvious relief. Mason scanned them quickly, his expression growing darker with each page. "Interesting reading," he said finally. "Bill Carver, you're under arrest for cattle poisoning and property destruction." He nodded to one of his deputies, who moved toward Dalton's foreman with practiced efficiency. "What?" Carver's hand dropped toward his gun but stopped when he found 3 rifles pointed at his chest. "You can't prove nothing, Mason." "Actually, I can." Mason held up one of the documents. "See, Marcus Webb kept real detailed records, including a receipt for the poison you bought in Denver last week and instructions from Mr. Dalton here about which water sources to contaminate." The color drained from Carver's face. That ain't. Course, Webb's been keeping records on a lot of things," Mason continued conversationally. "Property assessments that coincidentally favored certain buyers, survey reports that moved boundary lines in mighty convenient directions, water rights that mysteriously changed hands after the original owners suffered unfortunate accidents." Dalton's confidence was cracking like ice in a spring thaw. "Sheriff, surely you don't believe—" "What I believe, Harrison, is that you've been running the biggest land grab scheme in territorial history, and these good folks risked their necks to prove it." Mason looked at Catherine with something approaching respect. "Takes guts to go up against a man like Dalton, especially when you got secrets of your own." Catherine's heart sank. Here it came, the humiliation, the exposure, the inevitable moment when everyone learned who she really was. "See, I got a telegram from Boston yesterday," Mason continued. "Seems the district attorney back there has been looking for a certain Catherine Mills, not to arrest her, mind you, but to thank her." Catherine blinked. "To what?" "Turns out that ledger you stole from Charles Whitmore led to the biggest corruption investigation in Massachusetts history. They arrested 12 city officials, 4 bankers, and a federal judge, recovered nearly $500,000 in stolen funds." Mason's weathered face cracked into something that might have been a smile. "You're a hero back in Boston, Miss Mills. They want to give you a medal." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Catherine gripped Jake's arm for support, hardly able to process what she was hearing. But the newspapers said..." "The newspapers said what the Whitmore family paid them to say, at least until the truth came out." Mason folded the documents carefully. "Course, by then you were long gone. Took them months to track down where you'd disappeared to." "She's still a thief," Dalton snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. "She admitted it herself. She stole those papers tonight, broke into a man's home." "She exposed a criminal conspiracy," Pastor Williams interrupted firmly, "in both Boston and here. I'd say that makes her a crusader for justice, not a thief." Jake squeezed Catherine's hand. "I'd say it makes her the bravest woman I've ever known." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow, not painful, but overwhelming, like being struck by sunlight after months in darkness. She looked up at Jake's face, saw the pride there, the admiration, the something deeper that made her breath catch in her throat. "Still doesn't change anything," Dalton said desperately. "Those documents were illegally obtained. They can't be used as evidence." "Actually, they can," Mason replied. "See, I had a warrant to search Webb's property. Been working on it for weeks, ever since the territorial governor started asking questions about all these convenient land transfers." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Just hadn't gotten around to serving it yet. Course, if these documents happen to be discovered during the execution of that warrant..." Catherine felt laughter bubble up in her chest, not hysterical, but genuinely amused. "You've been investigating Dalton all along." "Let's just say some of us have been paying attention to the details," Mason said with a dry smile. "Harrison Dalton, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of on the way to jail." What followed was chaos. Dalton raging and threatening, his men being disarmed and shackled, Pastor Williams offering prayers for everyone involved. But through it all, Catherine was aware only of Jake's presence beside her, solid and warm and reassuring. "It's over," she whispered, hardly able to believe it. "This part is," Jake agreed. "But Catherine..." She looked up at him, seeing something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "What?" "We need to talk. About Boston, about what happens now, about..." He gestured helplessly. "About us." Catherine felt her heart skip. "Us?" "Don't play innocent with me, Catherine Mills. You know damn well there's something between us. Has been since the day you first stood up to me in my own kitchen." His voice dropped to a whisper that only she could hear. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Before she could answer, Sheriff Mason cleared his throat. "If you folks are done having private conversations in public, I'd like to get these prisoners back to jail before they remember how outnumbered I am." As the law officers led Dalton and his men away, Catherine found herself alone with Jake in the candlelit church, Pastor Williams having discreetly withdrawn to give them privacy. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. "So," Jake said finally, "Boston wants to give you a medal, apparently. You could go back, resume your old life, accept the recognition you deserve." Catherine studied his face in the flickering candlelight, seeing the careful neutrality he was trying to project. "I could. Or I could stay here, help you rebuild the ranch, tend the chickens, fight with that temperamental stove." She paused, gathering courage. "Build a life with a man who makes me feel like I'm worth fighting for." The silence stretched taut. Then Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the hope and fear warring in his gray eyes. "Catherine," he said roughly, "there's something I need to tell you. About my past, about why I've been so careful to keep my distance." But Catherine pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. We all have ghosts, Jake. The question is whether we're going to let them keep haunting us, or whether we're going to build something new." And in the golden light of the church candles, with the sounds of justice finally being served echoing from the street outside, Jake Morrison kissed Catherine Mills like a man who'd finally found his way home. 3 months later, Catherine stood in her wedding dress, a simple blue gown she'd sewn herself from fabric Jake had brought back from Denver, and marveled at how completely her life had changed. The dress was nothing like the elaborate confection she'd worn to her engagement party in Boston, but it was infinitely more beautiful because it represented something real, something chosen freely, not arranged by ambitious families or financial considerations. "You look radiant," Mary Patterson said, adjusting the simple wreath of wildflowers in Catherine's hair, "like a woman who's found exactly where she belongs." Catherine smiled, touching the small gold band on her finger, not the ostentatious diamond Charles had given her, but a plain circle that Jake had forged himself in his workshop. It was imperfect, slightly irregular, and absolutely perfect. "I feel like I've been sleepwalking for years, and I'm just now waking up," Catherine admitted. "Everything before this seems like it happened to someone else." Through the bedroom window, she could see the guests gathering in the garden Jake had helped her restore. The entire territory seemed to be represented. Ranchers who'd once been too proud to accept help from a mail-order bride, now eager to celebrate the woman who'd helped bring down Harrison Dalton. Dalton himself was in territorial prison awaiting trial, along with Marcus Webb and Bill Carver. The evidence they'd stolen that night had led to a cascade of revelations, property restored to its rightful owners, and the kind of justice frontier communities rarely saw. "Mrs. Morrison," Mary said, testing out the name, "has a nice ring to it." Catherine's smile widened. Mrs. Morrison. Mrs. Jake Morrison. After months of thinking of herself as a refugee, a temporary arrangement, an unwanted complication, the permanence of it was intoxicating. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Catherine, it's time." Jake's voice through the door made her heart skip, just as it had every day for the past 3 months. She'd learned so much about him during that time. How he took his coffee black and strong. How he gentled horses with patience rather than force. How he read Shakespeare by lamplight when he thought no one was watching. She'd also learned about the wife who died in childbirth 5 years ago, taking their unborn son with her. The tragedy that had closed Jake's heart and made him believe he was meant to live alone. It had taken weeks of careful conversation to convince him that loving again wasn't a betrayal of what he'd lost, but a tribute to it. "Ready?" she called back, smoothing her skirts one final time. Pastor Williams was waiting at the makeshift altar Jake had built under the ancient oak tree behind the house. The same tree where they'd first kissed, where they'd shared countless evening conversations, where Jake had finally asked her to be his wife with words as simple and honest as the man himself. "Catherine Mills, will you stay with me forever?" The ceremony was brief but meaningful, witnessed by people who'd become genuine friends rather than social obligations. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, and Jake kissed her with tenderness that made her toes curl in her borrowed shoes, Catherine felt the last of her old life finally slip away. She was no longer Catherine Mills, the scandal-ridden refugee from Boston society. She was Catherine Morrison, ranch wife, partner, and beloved of a man who saw her true worth. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with dancing under the stars and enough food to feed half the territory. But Catherine's favorite moment came near midnight, when she and Jake finally escaped to the porch of their home, and sat together in comfortable silence. "Any regrets?" Jake asked softly, echoing the question he'd asked her that first terrible night when Dalton had threatened them both. "None," Catherine replied, meaning it completely. "You?" "Only that I wasted so many months being afraid of this." Jake pulled her closer, and she settled against his shoulder with a contentment that went bone deep. "Afraid of caring about someone again, of risking my heart. And now? Now I know that some risks are worth taking." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You brought this place back to life, Catherine. You brought me back to life." Above them, the Montana sky stretched endlessly, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere in the distance, the coyote howled. Not lonely now, but wild and free and completely at home in the vast wilderness. Catherine thought about the journey that had brought her here, the scandal, the shame, the desperate decision to answer a stranger's advertisement for a wife. Every painful step had been necessary, she realized, leading her exactly where she needed to be. Jake, she said softly. What is it, sweetheart? Thank you. For what? Catherine smiled, thinking of all the things she could say, for giving her a home, for seeing past her mistakes, for loving her despite everything. Instead, she simply said, for letting me stay. Jake's arms tightened around her, and in his voice she heard all the love and promise she could ever want. Catherine Morrison, you're not going anywhere. This is your home now. I'm your home now. And as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky over their ranch, their land, their future, Catherine finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere completely. She had found her place in the world, and it was right here in the arms of a man who'd kissed her tears away and called her his destiny. 1 year later, Catherine Morrison stood in the same garden where she'd first planted hope alongside seeds. But now she wasn't alone. Little Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, just 3 months old, slept peacefully in her arms while Catherine supervised the harvest of vegetables that would see them through the winter. The garden had tripled in size, fed by the clear water that flowed freely since Dalton's illegal diversions had been removed. She's got your stubborn streak already, Jake observed, approaching from the barn with their mail. Refusing to sleep unless she's outside where she can keep an eye on everything. Catherine laughed, adjusting the baby's blanket against the crisp autumn air. She's a Morrison. She needs to know her territory. The ranch had prospered beyond their wildest dreams. With Dalton's forced sales reversed and water rights restored, the entire valley had experienced a renaissance. Jake's cattle were sleek and healthy, the hay barns were full, and they'd even hired 2 hands to help with the expanding operation. Jake approached, carrying a thick envelope with official markings. Letter from Boston, he said, settling beside her on the porch swing he'd built for quiet evenings like this. Catherine adjusted Sarah in her arms and accepted the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation to receive the Medal of Civic Courage from the Governor of Massachusetts, along with a personal note from District Attorney Fletcher thanking her again for her role in exposing the Whitmore corruption ring. They want to name a park after you, Jake observed, reading over her shoulder. Catherine Mills Memorial Gardens. Catherine Mills is dead, she said firmly, setting the letter aside. She died the day I married Jake Morrison and became part of something bigger than myself. Jake's arm tightened around her. You could still go. Accept the recognition, see old friends. My friends are here. Catherine gestured toward the valley where smoke rose from neighboring chimneys, where children played in yards that belonged to families no longer threatened by men like Harrison Dalton. My life is here. My future is here. Little Sarah stirred in her arms, making the soft sounds that meant she'd be demanding her dinner soon. Catherine marveled at the tiny, perfect fingers, the rosebud mouth, the way she instinctively turned toward her mother's voice. This child would grow up knowing she was wanted, knowing she belonged somewhere without question. Besides, Catherine added, I've learned that the best medals aren't made of gold or silver. They're made of moments like this, sitting with the man you love, holding your child, watching the sunset over land you fought to protect. Jake chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. When did you become such a philosopher, Mrs. Morrison? When I stopped running from my past and started building my future. Catherine looked out over the prosperous ranch, the garden bursting with late-season vegetables, the cattle dotting the pasture like dark stars. Do you know what I realized today? What's that? I spent years in Boston believing I was useless, ornamental. Then I spent months here proving I could be useful, practical. But I never understood the most important thing until now. Which is? Catherine smiled, thinking of all the ways her life had changed, not just the external transformations from city lady to ranch wife, but the deeper changes in how she saw herself, how she moved through the world. I learned that worth isn't about being useful or ornamental. It's about being loved, being chosen, being someone's destiny, just as they are yours. She looked up at Jake, seeing her whole future reflected in his storm-gray eyes. "You taught me that, Jake Morrison. You loved me before I was anything more than a broken woman with a carpetbag and a head full of secrets." "You were never broken," Jake said firmly. "Bent, maybe. Tested, but never broken. And you were always my destiny, Catherine, from the moment you climbed down from that stagecoach and lifted your chin like you were ready to take on the whole territory." Sarah began to fuss, and Catherine rose to take her inside for feeding. As she passed the kitchen where she'd burned so many meals learning to be a frontier wife, the parlor where they'd planned their resistance against Dalton, the bedroom where their daughter had been born on a snowy February morning, Catherine felt the deep satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. Later that evening, after Sarah was fed and sleeping, Catherine and Jake stood together on their porch, watching the first stars appear in the vast Montana sky. The air held the crisp promise of winter, but also the assurance that spring would follow, as it always did. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, echoing the question that had become their private ritual. "Only that I didn't answer your advertisement sooner," Catherine replied, leaning into his warmth. "Well, I suppose some things are worth waiting for." "Are we?" "We're worth everything," Jake said firmly, and kissed her as the coyotes began their evening song across the prairie. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, the same sound that had brought her here over a year ago, desperate and alone. But now it didn't call to her with promises of escape or new beginnings. Now it was simply part of the music of home, no more tempting than the wind in the wheat or the lowing of cattle. Catherine Morrison had found her place in the world, and it was right here in the arms of a man who'd kissed her tears away and called her his destiny. She'd traded a life of ornamental uselessness for one of meaningful partnership, traded Boston society for frontier community, traded a gilded cage for the vast freedom of the American West. And in the golden light of their porch lamp, with their sleeping daughter safe inside and their prosperous ranch spreading out around them, Catherine knew she'd made the best bargain of her life. Some love stories begin with grand gestures and fairy tale romance. Others begin with desperate measures and practical arrangements. But the best ones, the ones that last, begin with two broken people who decide to heal each other, one small act of courage at a time. As the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Catherine Morrison held her husband close and whispered the words that had become her daily prayer. "Thank you for letting me stay." And Jake's answer, as always, was the same. "Catherine Morrison, you're not going anywhere. This is your home now. I'm your home now. Forever." "Forever," she agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Thank you for joining Catherine and Jake on their journey from strangers to soulmates in the Wild West. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with grand plans, but with the simple courage to answer when love calls, even when it comes in the most unexpected forms. If this tale of second chances and frontier romance touched your heart, please share it with someone who believes in the power of love to transform even the most broken souls. Until our next adventure together, may you find your own piece of paradise, whether it's on a Montana ranch or wherever your heart calls home.